there is no partiality with God. He doesn't care whether you are a Gentile or a Jew. God approves those who keep his righteous commandments, God, whether Jew or Gentile, and God disapproves of those who do not keep his righteous commandments, whether Jew or Gentile. That's the point. All right, guys, welcome back to our teaching in Romans. Now, the last time we were here, we were in the first section of chapter 2 as we were dealing with Paul's theme of no partiality with God. And the primary idea of that was that he was dealing with the Gentile nations. That is, he was coming out of chapter 1, remember, out of all of the verboseness of sins that he was talking about, and how that the nations, the Gentile nations who once knew God but rejected God, God responded in judgment to them by turning them over to all types of sins, especially sexual sins. And as these Gentiles, or peoples as a whole, you can consider it that way, Gentiles or even humanity as a whole continued in their rejection towards God, God just backed up altogether, and he allowed them to see and to experience a world without him. And thus we see the engrossment of humanity in all forms of sin. Okay. Now, even though it is basically humanity that he was talking about, it is clear that he was moving towards this particular idea concerning the Gentile worlds, because his whole point that he's going to make in chapters 1, 2, and 3 is both groups, that is, the Gentiles as well as the Jews, have sinned against God, and therefore there can be no salvation based upon works. There can be no salvation based upon any type of performance, because whether you're a Gentile, you have sinned, or whether you're a Jew, you have sinned. So thus, the only way that salvation can be acquired or attained by anyone is through faith alone, chapters 4 and 5. Okay, but we don't want to go there. We're just simply reviewing what we did last week. So he continued to talk about the point of chapter 2, that is, certain Gentiles may say that, well, we are not lawless Gentiles. We live according to a law. Now, go back and look at that video if you haven't looked at it, because it is extremely important to understand how Paul is differentiating having a principle of law from the law, because we'll notice that in the text of Scripture, and we're always using NASB 95 edition, but in the text of Scripture, it may say the law, and it'll capitalize law, that is the L in law, to give you the understanding that this is the law of Moses. But that is not the case. There always has to be a distinction in the text when Paul is talking about a principle of law and referencing the law of Moses. Okay, but anyway, so I don't want to get in all of that again, but you need to go back and check out that video, and we're going to continue to talk about this same concept because it's going to carry over in the remainder of chapter 2. But let's complete this review. So what was going on? So there may be the cultured Gentile or the cultured Greek who would dare say, well, we don't get into all of this debaseness of sin because we have a law that we live by. And Paul is simply trying to say what? And even if you do have some principal form of law that you live by, can you deny that you have still sinned against God? And thus, whether a little bit or a lot, you have still sinned against God. And he's bringing in the whole issue of chapter 1, God bringing judgment upon those who reject him, even upon those who sin. And thus, whether a little bit of sin or a whole lot of sin, it doesn't matter with God. And God is no respect of persons. Whether you sinned in a principle of law or you sinned without a principle of law, Gentiles, you are still under the judgment of God. And so now, as we move into the latter section of chapter 2, he's going to carry over that same principle theme, that is a principle of law, even specifically the law of Moses. Okay. And now he's going to talk about the Gentiles. He's going to talk about the Jews to deal with the same instance. That is, as God has no partiality with Gentiles in their sins, there will be judgment. God also has no partiality with Jews in their sins. There will be judgment. Even more so because they don't have simply a principle of law that they live by. They have the codified specific law of Moses that God gave himself. Thus, they themselves are under judgment as well. They too have sinned. Okay, and he's going to bring all of that out more so in chapter 3. But anyway, all right, enough of that. This section is not a long section, and I don't think it's going to be a really long video because for the most part, I've just explained it. But let us now just simply get into the text, and we'll talk about certain issues as we move along. Verse 17, but if you bear the name Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God and know his will and approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth. We need to go on. It is a long sentence. But you, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one should not steal, do you steal? Might as well. You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? Okay, so let me stop there, because it is so tightly integrated, Paul's thought. But now, as I said to you guys earlier, he is moving into the domain of the Jews. He's dealing with the Jewish people, because remember, biblically speaking, there are only two kinds of people, Jews and Gentiles. He has just dealt with the Gentile world, and his whole point was the Gentiles are under sin. But even more specifically in chapter 2, what? That the Gentiles, there is no respect of persons with God, whether Gentiles are in sin superfluity, that is, they're committing all kinds of sin, or Gentiles are living under some form of a law. Notice I keep saying a law, not the law of Moses, but a principle of law. And thus their sinning is curtailed by some principle that they are living by. Still, they are under sin. Paul applies the same idea now to the Jews. And so what does he say? But if you bear the name Jew, and here's the second point, that the second people, you're either Gentile or you're now a Jew. Being Jew and Gentile, that's everybody. That speaks for every person in the world. You're either a Jew or you are a Gentile, according to biblical classification. But now let's get into the text. As I just said, this same idea is now being applied to the Jews. That is, having a principle of law. And Paul is going to get more so. Not only did the Jews have a principle of law that they lived by a specific code, the Mosaic law that they lived by. And the point is, and thus, if you do not live by your own principle of law, even the law of Moses, you yourself are guilty of sin, and God, who has no partiality in judging the Gentiles, This same God has no partiality when he comes to judge the Jews. And this is also important too, especially when we understand that first century Jews, when the time that Jesus came, they were taught that simply being a Jew, you are guaranteed to enter into the kingdom of God. Just as long as you're Jewish, you're all right with God. And Paul is going to deal with this fraudulent idea even here. But now let's just simply go into the text. Short it will be. But what does he say? So if you bear the name of Jew and rely upon the law. Now, let me say this before I even go any further as we deal with the first instance of the law. In the text of English, in our translation here, in almost, and I'm using NASB 95 edition. In almost every single instance, it translates it the law. And notice the law, that is the L in law, is capitalized. So the translators are referring to the specific law of Moses, the specific law of Moses. However, this is incorrect. The translator should not be involved in the interpretation here. This is what we also call dynamic equivalence. But it is not so much that the word is not law, but their translation. They added the. So what I've done for you guys is I've highlighted it in green everywhere where law in both English and especially the Greek text, because we go from the Greek text. The scriptures were originally written in the Greek, and from the Greek we translate into the English. So thus I have highlighted it in green everywhere where law is absent the definite article. You see, because in our English text, it is translated the law in every occurrence. This is wrong. So here you'll see in verse number 17, the word is a law. And then again, you'll see it in verse number 23. You'll see it in verse number 25. And thus you'll see it continually. Wherever I've highlighted it in green, it is a law. Now, on the other side, when Paul uses the definite article with nomos, that is the law, the reference is specifically to the law of Moses. So what you have to understand, and I'll explain it as we walk through the text, where you see it in green, there is no the law. It is simply a law. When you see it highlighted in the red, the article is there, that is the, and thus it is the law. And the reference is to the law of Moses. So what the point of matter, what Paul is doing is, he is talking about in the same way that he talked about the Gentiles. If you Gentiles have some form, that is in the earlier part of chapter 2, some form of law, some principle of law that you live by. And the Jews also. So if you Jews have some principle form of law, but even more so, what? They not only have a principle form of a law that they lived by, they had a specific code of law that they lived by, the law of Moses. And therefore, Paul would call it the law. So he would switch from a principle form of law to the law of Moses specifically. Okay, now, with that, let's just simply go into the text. So if you bear the name Jew, 17, and you rely upon a law, you see it, a principle, just like the Gentiles. You rely upon a principle of law and you boast in God, that is, boast in knowing the true God. And there is a sense of condescension in the text. That is, Paul is speaking that the Jew is somewhat looking down upon the Gentiles because the Gentiles are worshiping idols and they are ignorant of the true God. But the Jew here is prideful and feels arrogant in himself because he knows God. He knows the true God, while these foolish, ignorant, and unlearned Gentiles don't know him. And that's the idea. That's the feel of how Paul is speaking. You see, you're a Jew and you rely upon a principle of law, not the law of Moses he's speaking of. He's going to talk about that. But you have a boast in God and you know God's will and you approve the things that are essential. And where it says are essential, that's ta diapheronta. Approve the things that are superior. So not simply essential, but the things that are superior. That is, so you can see how you look down the Jew or maybe looking at the Gentile and how they live and the principle of law by which the Gentiles live, and the Jew measure themselves by the principle of law in which they live. And they say our principle of law is better, is superior. So you approve those things. Notice, being, verse number 18, instructed out of the law. That is, being instructed out of not simply a principle of law, but the specific code, the law of Moses, which is the law of God, and it is superior to any kind of man-made law or governance. But anyway, so the point that he's continuing to talk about, so you Jew have these specific benefits concerning yourself. But let me continue on. Verse number 19, talking about the Jew, and you are confident. You see what that word confident, you are confident. The word is actually poitos. That word is in the perfect tense. What Paul is saying is this: you have settled in your mind. This is nothing to be argued. It's nothing to even argue about. Your confidence. You are confident of what? That you yourself, that you Jew are what? A guide to the blind. The blind is the Gentile who does not know God. A light. You Jew are a light to those who are in darkness. Gentiles again in darkness. You are a corrector. That word corrected could also mean instructor, instructor of the foolish, the unlearned Gentiles. You are what? A teacher of the immature. Again, a reference to the Gentiles or even those who don't have as much knowledge. So you can see how there is a puffed upness of the Jew because of the law of Moses that they live by. In other words, the Jewish principle of law that they live by, which is the law of Moses, but they have this arrogance in themselves because they live, or should I even say it this way, they assume themselves under this law. Because the point that Paul is going to make is, even having this principle of law, they ain't living by it. But let's go on. But what? Corrector of foolish, teacher of immature, having in, notice, the law. Here is that the law of Moses, the embodiment, because it is indeed the embodiment of knowledge and truth. The law of Moses is the expressed knowledge of God, what God himself has given to man. And God did not give this express knowledge to mankind in general. He only gave this knowledge to the Jewish people. And thus what Paul is saying is there has been a wrongful inbreeding of arrogance in the Jew because of this privilege of God granting them this greater principle of law, the law of Moses. But point again, he continues on to say what? You therefore, here's the problem, who teach another. And the word for another here, verse number 21, is heteron. Again, this is not teaching another Jew. Heteron means another of a different kind. So therefore, what Paul is saying is, you who teach another, you Jew who teach a Gentile, trying to tell him and correct him and instruct the Gentile, do you not teach yourself? What are you talking about, Paul? You who preach one that one should not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? But again, all of these things are in the very essence of the law. This higher law, this more excellent, this superior principle of law that you live by, you even codified in the law. When you say codified, that is written and maintained in those 613 commandments in the law of Moses. You have this superior law. You feel good about yourself because you are assumed under that law. Notice I said again, assumed under that law by being Jewish. But Paul said, and you feel good about yourself. You think that you can correct people, teach people, instruct people, namely the Gentiles, because they're ignorant and foolish without understanding. He said, but the problem is you don't abide by your own law. You don't abide by your own principle of life, principle of the law, even the Mosaic law. And then he begins to give specific examples how they themselves break the very law that they feel good about. And he says, and what again, let's go all the way back here. Do you preach? Again, notice the audience that they will be preaching to the Gentiles. Don't steal. And guess what? But do you steal? And then again, what does he say? Do you say that one should not commit adultery to the Gentiles? But hey, look amongst yourselves. Are you guys doing the same thing, committing adultery? And then as you talk about the idols of the Gentiles, because that's what the Gentiles were serving, demons, namely idols. Do you who abhor idols? So there's be absolute rejection of the Jew from about idolatry. He said, but do you rob temples? But in the robbing of the idol temples, the Jew would say, well, it's nothing, because an idol is nothing. It's to be abhorred and all of this. So we can just take stuff. But nevertheless, you're breaking the commandment of your law. Do not steal. So the whole essence of what Paul is trying to say is having the Jew having a superior law, being confident, even arrogant, because they are assumed under this law because they are Jews. Paul is stating that what? You too are breaking your own principle of law, even the law of Moses. So therefore, his point is, and he's beginning to make, the Jew is also sinning. But overall, the context of all of chapter 2 is, and there is no partiality with God. If God judges the Gentiles for their sins, whether a lot of sins apart from law, or what the Gentiles would say, a little sin under some principle of law, nevertheless, they sin, and God will judge the Gentile. God will also judge the Jew for their sins under whether a principle of law, even the specific law of Moses. There will be no impartiality with God, whether you are Gentile or whether you are Jew. And that's the idea. But anyway, let's continue on. So he says in verse number 23, I think I read this part, you who boast in the law through your breaking, you who boast in a law, that is a higher principle of law, more superior than any Gentile, but through your breaking the law, that is the law of Moses, do you dishonor God? And he put that in a question mark. Actually, originally, let me say this. Originally in the Greek text, it was given in unctuals, that is all capital letters. Original Greek manuscripts were written in all capital letters. and they were without punctuation. Punctuations were later added so that we can kind of understand when he was saying, asking a question or making a declarative statement, a period. Okay, so here they have a question mark. However, the context is not asking a question. The context is making a statement. Paul is dealing with the whole theme of breaking God's commandment or sinning against God. Go back earlier. The Gentiles, what did they do? Sinned against God. And now he is furthering his point concerning the Jews. And what have the Jews also done? They have sinned against God. So the statement should read, you who boast in a law through the breaking of the Mosaic law, you dishonor God. He's not asking them, are they doing it? He is telling them, you are dishonoring God through the very breaking of the specific commandments given in the law of Moses. Okay, so now let's continue. For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written. For indeed, let me stop there. Let me stop there and then I'll continue on. And thus he quotes, I think it's from Isaiah and Ezekiel quotes it. Ezekiel has the better quote. I think it's like in chapter 36. But the point that he's dealing with is, as the Jews have gone out into the Gentile world, God's intent for them was to be a light to the Gentiles by the way that they live, to show the Gentiles how to live righteously by the serving of the true God. But instead of them doing that, they participated in the similar sins of the Gentiles. So instead of God's name, which was upon the Jews because they were covenanted with God, instead of God's name being glorified in how the Jews lived amongst the Gentiles, God's name was actually blasphemed. God was made to look bad. Why? Because of how the Jews lived when they were amongst the Gentiles. They lived just as bad as the Gentiles. And that's why he quoted, the name of God is blasphemed amongst the Gentile. It was not God's name made to look bad because of what God had done. God's name was made to look bad because of what the Jews had done when they went amongst the Gentiles. And so that's why I say, just as it is written. Now, let's continue verse 25. For indeed, circumcision is of value if you practice the law. But if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So, if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you who though having the letter of the law and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? Might as well. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. Okay, kind of long, but it makes perfect sense as Paul continues his argument. So he says what? For indeed, circumcision is of value. Now, circumcision relates all the way back to verse number 17, a Jew. So here's just another way of saying a Jew. For Jews, according to the covenant that God made with Abraham, what is that? Genesis chapter 17. On the 8th day, were to be all males, were to be circumcised. Okay, so for what circumcision, being a Jew, that's the idea, is of value if you practice, and he didn't say the law. Notice I put it in green. He said a law. if you are practicing a law, a principle that you live by. And of course, the principle that the Jew would live by would be the law of Moses. But again, his argument. So your circumcision, you feeling good because you are Jewish. Should you feel good about that? The point is, your circumcision can have value only if you are living righteously, practicing a law. But what if you are a transgressor of law, that is a transgressor of a principle of law? We know for the Jew that principle would be what? Expressly the law of Moses. But if you are a transgressor, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. In other words, the value of being a Jew is now worthless. Why? Because circumcision only has value if you are keeping the righteous standards of law, that is, the righteous standards of the law of Moses. So simply being a Jew, as Paul is going to further expound on in chapter 3, simply being of Jew really doesn't mean so much if you are not keeping the law of God. But if you are not keeping the law of, and if you are not keeping the law of God, you might as well not even be circumcised. In God's eye, in a sense, you're just like a Gentile. Not that you are a Gentile. A Jew can never become a Gentile, and neither can a Gentile ever become a Jew. One is born. You are born Jewish. You are born Jewish, and you cannot change this. You are born a Gentile, and this you cannot change. Even if a Gentile circumcises him or himself, he still cannot become a Jew. It is impossible. Okay, but anyway, now let's go back to the text. I did want to say that point, though. But the point he's talking about in being Jewish, because remember, in the earlier argument, they were feeling good about being the Jew. They were thinking that we can teach the Gentiles, and they were boasting in being a Jew. They were boasting of being a guide, being a light unto the ignorant Gentile. But Paul is saying, but if you're not keeping the law of God, you might as well not be a Jew. That is, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Then he goes to verse number 27. It's really important that we get this part. And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you who having the very letter of the law and circumcision, but you are a transgressor? Will he not judge you if you're a transgressor of a law? In other words, if you have a Gentile, but nevertheless, the Gentile is living righteously, and his righteous living, let's examine that. That's what the law says. That's what the law of Moses says. The law of Moses says not to steal. The law of Moses says not to bear witness. The law of Moses says not to commit adultery. Now, here you have this Gentile actually living in such a way he satisfies the law of Moses. And here now you have the Jew, a Jew who has been circumcised, that is, circumcised under the law, circumcised the covenant that he has with God to keep the law of Moses. But the Jew who is circumcised to keep the law of Moses is actually a transgressor of that principle of law that he is supposed to live by. You get it now? Will not the Gentile, who by nature is keeping the things contained in the law, will he not judge the Jew who is circumcised, assumed under the law, but is really a breaker of the law? So Paul is saying here, rightly, the Gentile will judge the Jew if the Jew is not a keeper of the principle of law that he should keep, namely the law of Moses. And this is what he's talking about in verse number 27. The Gentile will judge the Jew. So there is no inherent, notice, there is no inherent superiority for the Jew over the Gentile if the Jew is not keeping the law of Moses. There is, and this is what verse number 27 is bringing out, again, no partiality with God. Because notice what he said, will not the Gentile, the one who is uncircumcised, will not he judge the Jew, the one who is circumcised, but is a transgressor of law, even the law of Moses? Will not the Gentile judge the Jew? Why? The essence of it all in all of chapter 2, for there is no partiality with God. God doesn't care if you're a Gentile. If you're a Gentile who sinned, there will be judgment from God. If you're a Gentile who keeps the righteousness of God, even that righteousness which will be found in the law of Moses, you will be approved of God. If you are a Jew who is circumcised, assumed under the law of Moses, but you are a transgressor of law, even the law of Moses, there will be judgment for you. But if you are a Jew circumcised under the law and are a keeper of the law, you will be approved by God. For what? There is no partiality with God. He doesn't care whether you are a Gentile or a Jew. God approves those who keep his righteous commandments. God, whether Jew or Gentile, and God disapproves of those who do not keep his righteous commandments, whether Jew or Gentile. That's the point. But let's continue. We're almost at the end. For verse number 28. He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. In other words, simply being circumcised and simply having the garments or what you may want to appear as a Jew, looking like a Jew, dressing like a Jew, and especially here concerning the circumcision. This does not make you a Jew. Now, he is not talking about a national Jew, a national Jew. You're born a Jew. You can't change these things. But what Paul is talking about more so here is a spiritual Jew, a Jew who is acceptable before God, or what we would simply call it, a true Jew. A true Jew is not one who is just simply circumcised. It is not one simply born into a Jewish family, but a true Jew that is recognized by God and approved and accepted by God is not one simply circumcised, but one who is inwardly, and that word for inwardly, secretly. Circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. That is, circumcision of the heart, one who in his heart desires, a Jew who in his heart desires God, loves God, and therefore is obedient to God. And this done by the Spirit. This no one can see. That's why I say it's one who is inward. That word actually is krutos, which is one who is secretly. You cannot see the heart of this Jew. You understand that? But it becomes evident in how this Jew lives. Why? He lives righteously before God. And this is a Jew who is a true Jew, one who is acceptable before God. Notice, one who is circumcised in the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. When he says not by the letter, that simply means not simply circumcised because it is written that he should be circumcised. The Genesis chapter 17 thing again. I'm a Jew because I'm circumcised. Well, why were you circumcised? Because God made a covenant with Abraham back in Genesis chapter 17 that all of his children should be circumcised. This is circumcision by the letter, simply because it is written that way. But what about the devotion and loyalty and love that you have before God? This is that inward and secret circumcision. Yes, there will be the outward circumcision, yes, but more so, what? Truly being a Jew is secret circumcision because it has something that no one could see, something that is found in the heart that only God can see, and it evidences itself with their obedience towards God. And that's why he says, and thus this type of Jew, his praise is not from men, that is, other Jews looking, yeah, you're one of us. You're a Jew like us. Oh, yeah, glad you're a Jew. You're of God's chosen people. Yeah, we're all right with God. No, Paul said, his praise is not from men, such Jew, one of the heart, but that Jew, that secret Jew, that true Jew receives praise from God because that Jew truly loves God. Okay. All right. Thank you for joining me with that. I don't think that was actually too long, but let's summarize what we just did. So the whole point, even of the whole of chapter 2, as we've been talking about all along, the theme, it is an express theme, no partiality with God. And the whole point is dealing with having some form of a principle of law. Looking back on chapter 1, when there was such a whole lot of sin, just sinning everywhere, whether the Gentile would say, well, we have a law, rules that we live by, so we don't do all of that. Paul says, but yet you still do some of that, even if you don't want to say you have sinned like that. You cannot say you have not sinned, so yet you have sinned. Thus, there is no respect of persons between you Gentiles living under a principle of law and those other Gentiles living without any principle of law at all. God does not care. If you sinned, you will be judged. But if you keep the righteous commandments of God by nature, God will approve you. And then he turns his attention to the Jew. And you, Jew, in all of your spiritual arrogance, believing that you have an advantage over the Gentiles because of the principle of law that you have, even the law of Moses, and you feel confident that you are in good shape, but nevertheless, you break your own law, your own principle of law, even the law of Moses. You steal, you commit adultery, you rob temples, and therefore there will be judgment for you. Why? Just because you are circumcised does not mean that you are approved and acceptable before God. You are circumcised under this truly higher authority of law, but you're breaking the law. So therefore, your so-called circumcision becomes uncircumcision. And hey, you were thinking that the Gentiles, you have this advantage over the Gentile. But nevertheless, if the uncircumcised Gentile do the things pertaining in the law of Moses, if he do those things found in the law, this uncircumcised Gentile that you thought you were better than, he will actually judge you, because God is not so much concerned with circumcision or being uncircumcised. Why? True circumcision is not circumcision in your flesh. True circumcision in the letter. True circumcision is circumcision in the heart, one who loves and is loyal to God. So thus, the true Jew is not just a Jew circumcised, but the Jew who is loyal to God, and it is evidenced in his obedience to God. So thus, Paul sums it up, and thus there is no partiality with the Jew. Whether you are Gentile or whether you are Jew, there is no partiality with God. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining me with that. Join me next time as we continue on, as Paul goes specifically even more so concerning the Jewish people, because they were given unique privilege and advantage by God to deal with the whole issue, as Paul going to congeal it together from chapter 1 and then chapter 3, chapter 2 of course, but chapter 1 and chapter 3. All the world stands guilty before God, whether Gentile or Jew. Everybody has sinned, and if everybody has sinned, who can be saved? You can't be saved according to works. There must be another principle. There must be another means by which a person can be saved, and that is through faith in Jesus Christ alone. Okay, but anyway, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And also, if you have not subscribed, subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you subscribe to the Patreon. If this YouTube, all of this YouTube stuff, the ad interruptions is a problem, in Patreon, for our Patreon members, you can watch the entire video without any ads whatsoever. And it's not a lot. $7. What is that? A good cup of coffee? It's not a lot, but subscribe. You help support the channel, and we can continue on this manner of teaching, especially verse by verse teaching of the scripture. All right, guys. Thanks for joining me. God bless you. See you next time.